Welcome to the Policy Center for the New South. I am Helmut Sorge, columnist at the Policy Center, and today we will discuss the Atlantic Currents report, which is the flagship publication of the Atlantic Dialogues Conference. The 8th edition of this report is set against the backdrop of a health crisis that is full of lessons and an economic recovery marked by several social, economic, financial, and strategic challenges. The 14 chapters that make up this report attempt to identify the paradigms induced by the pandemic in terms of education, health, trade, respect for human rights, the fight against climate change, etc. As usual, Africa occupies a prominent place in the analyses and projections formulated by the 19 authors who contributed to the report, both with regard to the internal dynamics of the continent and its relationship with the rest of the wider Atlantic area. Stay tuned for this series of interviews with some of the authors as we dive a little bit more in the report itself. Thank you. Our guest today is Rim Berahab, author of the chapter Great Threats to Humanity, the Climate Crisis and Energy Transition. Rim Berahab is a senior economist at the Policy Center. She specializes in energy economics and work on several issues such as climate and long-term development, with a focus on Africa and Morocco. Madame Berahab, you argue in the introduction to your well-researched study, Great Threats to Humanity, Climate Crisis and Energy Transition, that an unprecedented threat to humanity exists. Global warming has profound implications for the environment, the global economy, international peace and stability upon which humanity depends. All of the above has been confirmed by science in even more dramatic terms. Is the global community up to this incredible historic challenge or still ignoring the dramatic developments?
Indeed, I think that the word is, I don't think that the word is now ignoring the dramatic consequences of climate change. I think that, on the contrary, the mood is changing, especially given the increasingly severe impact of climate change, the increasingly scientific warnings, and the increasingly sharp public outcry. In 2021 alone, we saw record-breaking numbers of natural disasters afflicting all continents and many communities, from wildfires in the Mediterranean and Northwestern America to droughts in Africa and Latin America. And this is only but a limited set of dramatic stories that have captured media recently and that have raised public concern about climate change. Beside that, in the 6 years since the Paris Agreement was adopted, a new scientific understanding have been emerging about the dramatic consequences of climate changes, especially given the publications of numerous reports by the leading authority on climate change, which is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or the IPCC. And in particular, in 2018, the IPCC Special Report on Global Warming arguably marked a turning point, where it showed that even levels that were previously considered safe, such as 2 degrees, carry dramatic consequences. At the same time, during the past 5 to 7 years, climate change has been increasingly considered as a matter of financial risk to firm and as a matter to risk to financial stability itself. And this entered mainstream since when the G20 requested the establishment of the Task Force of Climate related financial disclosure in 2015.
Don't you think that the public, the large public, does not really understand climate change? They see, as you said, a drought and they see hurricanes and they see the watering, the drowning part of Australia. But do they really understand the complications on temperature, 2 degrees, 1.5 degrees, or is that really an intellectual discussion?
No, I think that maybe in the early 2000s this understanding wasn't quite wide, but I think that in the past year we've seen many social movements advocating for countries or policymakers to take into account climate change into their policies and strategies. So I think that the mood is changing and it is only set to rise in the upcoming years given the severity and the high frequency of climate disasters. But of course there is a stark difference between understanding and acknowledging these consequences and actively acting against them.
And we are interrupted also in the predictions by political and military results as the war, for example, in Ukraine. The Germans decide now, because they don't get petrol anymore from Russia or gas, that they will reopen their coal energy. So the idea of, protecting our environment through, closing coal energy is just getting out of the window. So all the predictions have to be rethink.
I mean, this is a very good point because we all know that war undoubtedly brings dramatic economic, humanitarian, and energy consequences. But I'd like to point out that this shift back to coal and nuclear has happened before the war. It actually started at the end of 2021, where natural gas prices spiked and reached high-level records in all parts of the world. And this was the result from a confluence of supply and demand factors that have tightened progressively market over the past year. So as a result, the energy demand surge that happened in the mid-2020 was met by a supply that was not, or that was very slow to respond to price signals, which have led to numerous energy shortages. And in this context, this has led many countries, including advanced countries, to go back to coal instead of natural gas to produce electricity. So this had a ripple effect in the coal market as well and led to an increase in coal prices. And as you mentioned, this only show, these trends are being further increased by the current Russian-Ukraine war and only show the fragility of commitments of economies, even advanced one, when there is an exogenous shock. And of course, there is no doubt that due to exogenous shocks like wars, special attention needs to be given in the short term in terms to ensure peace, stability, economic growth. But I think that ignoring climate change will only further exacerbate those issues and further threaten energy security. But at the same time, we're at the moments when we see that this balance between energy security and energy transition is very fragile. This is why we need to really think about a holistic approach of energy transition, and we need to understand that there is not one energy transition, but different energy transitions, and that any strategy of decarbonization of energy or energy transition need to take into account socioeconomic and geopolitical context on each specific countries.
It has been critical for governments to develop plans to contain COVID-19 and counter the economic damage. You noted in your thoughtful paper, warning that the fundamental task of building a secure, sustainable, and climate-stable future should not be lost amidst immediate priorities. Aren't we just on this path, not only ignoring climate change, as we just discussed before, but reducing the virus to a footnote, because a vicious war is fought in Europe?
I think that this ties back to the previous question. And of course, wars, health pandemics, economic and humanitarian crises are all tragic. But if we keep waiting for the right moment to care about climate change, these moments might not come. And when it comes, it may be too late. I can't speak for Europe, but coming from Africa, I can give the perspective of the African continent. And what I can say is that, of course, this war is having far-reaching consequences on the continent. It is already leading to rising food prices and energy prices, which are in turn turn putting pressure on inflation in many African countries. But at the same time, climate change consequences are very real for those same African countries. So, for instance, the frequency of droughts in sub-Saharan Africa has nearly tripled in the last decade compared to the previous one. And given the current global adverse situation, these risks are further worsening the pressures on food prices and food supply. And I'll give just the example of the Horn of Africa, where the drought crisis is putting this region on the brink of a catastrophe. So the result of drought meant that overall cereal production in the last rainy season in southern Somalia was estimated to be 58% lower than the long-term average. And the same trends are noticed in the southeastern part of Kenya, where we're looking at a crop production estimated to be 70% lower than the average. And in addition to this, most water sources that have usually been resilient to climate change have dried up in Kenya. So as a result of all of these, according to the UN World Food Programme, drought has left an estimated 13 million people just in the Horn of Africa facing severe hunger amid the driest conditions in 4 decades. And this is just one example of climate change consequences which are more felt by middle-income and low-income countries, which are not the most responsible for climate change.
Plus the dramatic loss of wheat and cereals from Ukraine.
Exactly, which will further threaten food security in Africa. So we see that all of these considerations, the economy, the geopolitics and energy is linked. And when there is one disruption in one area, it can have a domino effect on the other areas.
Even without this European disaster, you warned about the battle against climate disaster. Current actions, you said, remain insufficient to avoid catastrophic warming that would threaten the survival of vulnerable countries and preservation of civilization as we know it. Where do you see the unprecedented global cooperation needed to combat climate change?
Indeed, so...
Tell me something optimistic.
Of course. There is always an optimistic side to everything. So, of course, we have seen international cooperation increasing in areas such as reducing methane reduction, building resilience to climate-related extreme weather events, prioritizing a green post-COVID recovery, and the role of public finance institutions. However, while interest among countries may overlap, most of the time priorities differ. So, acknowledging such differences between countries should be the first step to converging the priorities of a new international cooperation around climate change. In addition to that, superpowers like the EU, the US, or China must play an essential role in delivering climate policy goals while including developing countries into their policy discussion at the same time.
But it sounds wonderful that you say they should, but do they?
Well, we have seen that there have been attempts in the past. Some of them succeeded, some of them not. But what we see is that we need to scale up this type of cooperation and include developing economies into the design of this policy, because some climate change strategies can have a detrimental effect on their economic growth. So we need to take this into consideration in order to optimize the positive externalities of the strategies and minimize their negative effect. And this underscores the importance of public finance in climate cooperation. But beside that, the broader enabling environment and institutional framework, including regulations and governance, is also very crucial to scale up private investment and private finance. And in addition to cooperation on finance, I think that the international collaboration on climate change should also include the development and sharing of capacities, knowledge and information to support national action, because such collaboration is very essential to stimulate research and innovation that will be able to lower the cost of low carbon technologies and making them increasingly competitive and more widespread among the countries.
Thank you very much. Wonderful.
Thank
I
you.
learned a lot.
Thank you very much.